Good evening and welcome to the BLSI Philosophy series and our talk tonight by Professor Anthony Grayling on philosophy's history. My name is Andreas Wasmuth and I'm the co-convener for philosophy at the BLSI. Before I hand over to Don Cameron as our convener for philosophy to introduce Anthony, I just wanted to cover off a few logistical issues before we start. First of all, the presentation today, the talk will be videoed. So if you do not want to appear on the video, please obviously have your video settings off for the duration, because you will otherwise feature on the BLSI YouTube channel in about a month's time. The second thing is, could I please ask all of you, and that includes you, Chrissy, to go off the video, please. Take the video off and go on mute, because our bandwidth today is going to be severely challenged, particularly because we've got in excess of 125 people on this particular meeting. So this is a record for the BLSI. So please keep your videos off. That's much appreciated. Now, you can start your videos again for the Q&A session. And there's three ways of asking a question. One is in the old honored tradition by just raising your hand, and I shall try to pick you out, which might not be as easy as I think this time because there's lots of people here. The other way of doing it, you can use the Zoom facility, raise hand facility on the right-hand side in chat and under participants. And the third way of asking a question is in the chat room. I'll be monitoring the chat room as Anthony is talking, and I can ask the questions on your behalf if you want to. Now, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Don Cameron to make the introductions. Over to you, Don.
Well, thank you, Andreas, for keeping the engine room working on this this Zoom talk. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Anthony Grayling to speak to us once again. I think this is the third time, if I'm correct. It's very sad that we can't meet this time at the institution, but I'm grateful to him for agreeing to do it on Zoom. Professor Grayling is the author of more than 30 books on philosophical topics and is the founder and first master of New College of the Humanities. He's Vice President of Humanists UK and an honorary associate of the National Secular Society. He'll be speaking to us this evening on the history of philosophy, which is also the title of his most recent book published this year. I'm sure that we would have had copies available had we been in a live meeting, but as always, they're only a click away on your computer. I very much look forward to this evening's talk. Professor Grayling.
Thank you very much, Don, and what a pleasure it is to be back with you, even though just in this virtual form. Well, as Don says, so I've just recently published a big fat history of philosophy, and the process of writing it was a very interesting one. I mean, apart from the fact that I, of course, love the subject and writing about it, it's rather important for me at the outset.
You carry on. I can't stop it. I can't stop it.
Sorry, we're having a bit of cross purposes here. In fact, I think Andreas has a facility for muting everybody if he wanted to use it. Power, you know, censorship. Well, there was a very interesting challenge posed right at the outset of wanting to write about the history of philosophy, which is this, that the word philosophy denotes rational, careful inquiry. And right from the very beginning of the history of philosophy, 2,500 years ago, a philosopher was somebody, man or woman, who was interested in pretty well anything and everything. Somebody who might have been interested in the nature of physical reality, what we would now think of as a scientist. Somebody who was interested in history, wanted to find out about the past. Somebody who was interested in questions about society and political organization. Even indeed somebody who was interested in military affairs. Anything, any subject was available, accessible to inquiry, to careful, systematic, rational thought. And anybody who engaged in that kind of inquiry on any subject matter was called a philosopher. Of course, the word, as you know, in its etymology and its origin, it means a lover of wisdom, somebody who wants to learn and find things out. And that's why it had this very general application. And indeed, the word philosopher had that sense right up into the 19th century. Indeed, for most of the early part of the modern period, that is the 16th and 17th, 18th centuries, the word philosophy mainly denoted what we would now think of as science. So it was mainly concerned with inquiry into the structure and properties of the material universe. And in order to distinguish that kind of inquiry from inquiry into ethical and political questions, those individuals came to be called natural philosophers, and their subject was described as natural philosophy as opposed to moral philosophy, which was about society and people and politics. In the 19th century, an historian of ideas, a man called William Whewell, coined the term scientist on analogy with the term artist to describe somebody with an interest in natural science, as we would now call it. Indeed, he did so in response to a challenge by the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who said, we have a concept of philosophy here which is rather confusing because it applies both to moral philosophy and to natural philosophy. We need some new terminology. Up until that point, what we now today think of as philosophy was for a while called metaphysics. When William Hazlitt died, on his tombstone, it was written that he was the first metaphysician of his age. We would now, if he were a near contemporary of ours and had recently died, we would say he was one of the first philosophers of his age. Anyway, the confusion was cleared up in the 19th century, and the word philosophy started to mean what we now mean by it in our contemporary uses. And the word science and the word scientist, they had been coined and denoted people who were interested in chemistry, physics, biology, geology, that range of topics. So that was the first thing. And when you think of the history of philosophy, you're looking right back to the very beginning of inquiry, examination, research, investigation. You might think that it would be the history of ideas in general, the history of science, as well as the history of what we now think of as philosophy, the history of history. So this is very general, and therefore you have to be rather careful in selecting what strands in this great history of ideas are going to count as the history of philosophy in our modern contemporary sense of philosophy. So how do you do that? Well, the answer is you look at the range of concerns which are very familiar to us in contemporary philosophy. The theory of knowledge, metaphysics, ethics, political philosophy, the philosophy of science, the philosophy of mind. You look at these debates in contemporary philosophy, the kind of thing that you would study if you go to university to do a degree in philosophy, and you look back through the lens of these contemporary concerns at what you might call the case law, at the origin of debates about these matters running into the past. And that selects for you the strands of thought which are accurately and most distinctively recognizable as philosophy from our current perspective. Now, this way of doing things was actually originated by Hegel, in fact, in the earlier part of the 19th century. He was interested in the way that ideas that we now think of as very central to philosophy had originated with the classical period of ancient Greece, among the pre-Socratic philosophers, those who had come before Socrates and Plato. And in his way of thinking about these things, there is a narrative, a story to be told about the unfolding of debates about these matters. And of course, as you know, the 19th century was a great century of scholarship in the German-speaking world. Classical philology in particular was tremendously advanced by the researchers of scholars in that period. And they formalized a view of the history of philosophy, which has come to be canonical. And the first historian of philosophy writing in English who, as it were, encapsulated this history of philosophy, was George Henry Lewes, G.H. Lewes, the consort of George Eliot, the famous lady novelist. And his history of philosophy, which was originally a one-volume one and expanded eventually to a 4-volume history, is rather good for its time. It was written in the middle of the 19th century. And it's very careful. It's based a great deal on the German scholarship of the time. He was himself a Germanist in that he was very fluent in German. Wrote a wonderful biography of Goethe, which some people regard as still the very best biography of Goethe. But he was very well acquainted with the scholarship in the German universities of the day, and therefore wrote this very good, for its time, history of philosophy. And that was used by Bertrand Russell when, in the 1940s, he wrote his History of Western Philosophy, which brings the story of philosophy up to the beginning of the 20th century, in effect up to his own work, his own contributions in philosophy in the first decade or two of the 20th century. And he followed the lineaments, as it were, of the history of philosophy as it had been identified in the Hegelian and Lewis tradition of the 19th century. And that is why that view, the view which starts with Thales back in the early 6th century before the Common Era, BCE, and which runs through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle and the post-Aristotelian schools, and goes right up until the year 529 AD, as we used to say, 529 CE, as we now say, which is when the Emperor Justinian, a passionate, devoted Christian, banished the philosophers from Athens and closed the school of Athens, which had been founded nearly 1,000 years before by Plato, because the philosophers were teaching pagan thought, not orthodox and not consistent with Christianity. And from then until the Renaissance, really, until the early modern period, philosophy was very largely subjugated to, and at most and at best allied to, theology. And we see this, of course, in the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who had taken part in the great debate about whether or not the rediscovered writings of Aristotle should be taken seriously or not. There were many people in the church at the time who thought that Aristotle should be banned. Nobody should be allowed to read him because he was a pagan philosopher, and his views about the universe were in conflict with the orthodox view of the church. But St. Thomas Aquinas found a way of marrying church doctrine with Aristotle, indeed habilitating Aristotelian thought into Christian theology in his great multi-volume works. And that became the official Aristotelian philosophy, actually called Thomism after St. Thomas Aquinas, of the Roman Catholic Church. And it was in the very early modern period, in the 16th and 17th centuries, as a result, an inadvertent, accidental result of the Reformation, that a recovery of classical philosophy, classical Hellenic and Roman philosophy was possible, and correlatively, of course, the rise of the natural sciences was able to take place. 16th, 17th century being the age of the great scientific revolution and philosophical revolution. And I say it was inadvertent and accidental for the following reason, that in those parts of Europe which had become Protestant, Lutheran or Calvinist, as a result of Luther nailing his theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, in those parts of Europe, the ecclesiastical authorities, the Lutherans especially, and to a slightly lesser extent the Calvinists, because the Calvinists were really quite strict about what people were allowed to think and say and do and believe. But in the Lutheran parts especially, the ecclesiastical authorities were not powerful enough to impose themselves on people and to stop them from publishing or thinking or speaking in the way that was possible in the Catholic parts of Europe. In the Catholic parts of Europe, people like Cesare Vanini and Galileo and Giordano Bruno. They were prosecuted by the church, and in the case of Bruno and Vanini, were burned at the stake because they had accepted the Copernican view and had contravened Orthodox teaching. But in the Protestant parts of Europe, those controls had relaxed, and therefore these ideas were much, much more widely discussed. And also, of course, in the preceding century, publishing of books had become possible. And there was a tremendous spread of ideas, of knowledge about classical thought. And indeed, some of the great classics of the classical period were the very latest and most up-to-date works that were available to people in the Renaissance and Reformation period, which is why, in a way, it was such a rebirth and a great flourishing of thought. And so philosophy, as we understand it now, and as natural science, really did indeed take off in the 16th and 17th century, as if it were picking up again where at the point when philosophy became subsumed under theology, it had been left off. So when we look at a history of philosophy as such, and this is what I do in this book, one has to look at the way that philosophy arose at the beginning of the classical period, and then how it was refreshed and reinvigorated and really began to expand and flourish tremendously from the beginning of the modern period onwards. And in the intervening period, that is from the very early medieval period until the Renaissance, as I say, it was at most and best sort of handmade to theology, even though some of the thinkers, especially in the scholastic high medieval period, did make some very interesting contributions to philosophical thought, people like Peter Abelard and Occam and others. So what I have done in this book is to tell that story, that great adventure of ideas, which is the history of philosophy as we now understand what philosophy is. And let me just say something very, very quickly about that, because some of the major themes in the history of philosophy were identified by and discussed by Plato. You will know perhaps that remark made by A.N. Whitehead, who was a collaborator with Bertrand Russell on the Principia Mathematica, published at the very beginning of in the first decade of the 20th century, great work of logic, attempting to show that mathematics could be derived from logic. And in the process of that book, of course, many very important philosophical ideas for the last century of philosophical thinking were devised. Well, Whitehead said, philosophy is footnotes to Plato, meaning that Plato had identified the key questions that need to be raised and discussed in philosophy. And to a very large extent, this is true. Plato was a very great genius, but he didn't come out of nothing. He came out of a tradition which had been started really, I suppose, nearly 2 centuries before his time. With, and I've mentioned the person who is very often nominated as the so-called father of philosophy, who's a man called Thales, who lived in Miletus in the early part of the 6th century BCE. We know that he flourished sometime around 585 BCE because he predicted an eclipse that occurred in that year, worked it out, an eclipse which actually ended a battle that was taking place in Anatolia because the soldiers on both sides of the conflict were so terrified by the eclipse that they ran away. They thought the gods were angry with them. Well, it's because he had predicted that eclipse that we know that he lived round about that date. And I'll tell you in a moment why he's regarded as the father of philosophy, despite the fact that obviously, but unbeknownst to us, because we don't know the individuals and we don't have a record of their thought or any of their writings, but there must have been plenty of people before Thales who thought about these questions and debated them, and perhaps even indeed wrote about them. But any record of thinking in the thousands of years before the classical period of Greece is lost to us. And so there is this conventional beginning point for the story of philosophy. But just before I get to it, let me go back to that point I made about the things that we regard as very central to philosophy today. As I said, theory of knowledge, metaphysics, ethics, political philosophy, the sorts of things that we're familiar with in the contemporary study. And just to remind you, because I'm quite sure you know this, the theory of knowledge, sometimes called epistemology, addresses the question of what knowledge is and of how best we can get it. How do you define knowledge and differentiate it from mere belief or opinion? What are the concepts that need to go along with knowledge? Obviously, the concepts of truth, of evidence, of reason, of argumentation. Those are all ideas that we need to clarify and understand when we try to make sense of what we mean by knowledge. And just to give you a very quick indication of why this is important, at the very beginning of the modern revival of philosophy in the 16th and 17th centuries, one great question was, how do you tell the difference between alchemy and chemistry, medicine and magic, astronomy and astrology? In other words, which kinds of inquiry are really going to lead to genuine, substantial knowledge, and which are just a dead end, are just nonsense? What are the methods of inquiry that will lead us in the direction of truth? That is the great question in the theory of knowledge. And it is right there in Plato and indeed in his predecessors. Famously in Plato, and you may well have been reading this one in bed last night, his dialogue, the Theaetetus, specifically addresses this question. So do a number of his other dialogues. But this question is very, very deeply explored in that dialogue, asking how do you differentiate mere opinion or belief from knowledge, from a grasp of the truth, and what methods of inquiry will get us there. So that is a very, very central question in philosophy. The other great and central aspect of philosophy is metaphysics, which is an inquiry into the nature of reality. It asks, what is the ultimate nature of reality? What must reality be like? What properties are essential to anything which is going to have a chance of being real? What is it for anything to exist? What do we mean by existence? And when we think about the nature of reality and existence, we have to understand how change and motion, origins and endings can occur. How do we make sense of the world? Now, you might think that the natural sciences, and in particular physics, provide us with a very great deal of insight into this question. After all, physics is the examination of the structure and properties of matter, and its investigations, for example, into quantum phenomena, perhaps string theory, or all those other deep investigations into that question about the nature of physical reality, would seem to be a very major form of exploration into that great metaphysical conundrum. And indeed, it is part of that. It is a very important part of that. It is telling us something, leading us in the direction of much deeper understanding of the nature of physical reality. But we still need to address the question of whether physical reality is the only kind of reality there is. Are there other things? Are there non-physical things? Are there abstract entities? Do, for example, numbers or universals exist independently of spatio-temporal things? In other words, the whole question about what is real, what's actual, my thoughts, my ideas and memories are in some way real, and certainly they are in some way associated with physical things like the neurons in my cerebral cortices. But they don't have exactly the same properties that a physical thing like a brain has. So is that an indication that there might be something different? Could there be some plausibility to the idea that mental entities, events, and occurrences are non-physical in some way? Those questions still need to be addressed and resolved if you're going to have a complete and clear metaphysical picture about the nature of reality. Then obviously questions in ethics, questions about the right and the good, of how we should live, of what kinds of values we should use to shape and color our lives. These are very important and deep questions which every generation, every individual in every generation has to address and think about. and questions about the concepts and methods and the assumptions of all our inquiries, whether in science or in psychology or in history, these have to be examined as well. And the examination of them, of methods and assumptions, is very much a philosophical enterprise. So these are all the things that constitute philosophy, all the inquiries which we think of as constituting philosophy today, and which you would study if you went to do a philosophy degree. So it is these things, questions about knowledge, about reality, about truth, about reason, about the nature of mind, about the framework of our thinking, the concepts that we use. These are the things that we look at the record of debate about as constituting the history of philosophy as we understand that idea today. Well, I mentioned that we choose, for conventional reasons, this individual Thales as the father of philosophy. Why? Well, the answer is that he is the first person we know of, the first person of whom we have a clear, definite record, who asked and answered a very important question in a distinctively philosophical way. He asked the question, what is the arche of the universe? Where arche is an ancient Greek word that means principle or source or origin or nature. What is the source or the principle or the nature of the universe? And the answer that he gave to it was an answer that didn't appeal to religious traditions or legends or mythologies or poetry, but was an answer that was based on his best endeavors of observation and reason. The answer he gave was that the arche of the universe, its origin and principle, its essential nature, is water. Now, we may not agree with him today, but it's so interesting that he gave that answer. And you can reconstruct the answer as follows. He saw that water is everywhere. It's in the sea, it falls from the sky as rain, it's in your veins. If you cut your vein open, it's in the sap of the tree. It's not just ubiquitous, but it's also necessary for life. Animals, humans, plants die without it. It is a source of soil, he thought, because look at the Nile. When the Nile floods, it produces hundreds of millions of tons of silt. So obviously soil comes out of the water. And finally, it's the only thing that he knew that was metamorphic, which could take solid form as ice when it freezes, liquid form in its natural state, and could become a gas when it boils away as steam. So it's metamorphic, ubiquitous, essential, and productive. So therefore, it must be the stuff that everything in the universe comes from. Now, as I say, we're very unlikely to agree with him, but we can be very impressed indeed by the fact that he asked the question and sought to answer it just on the basis of observation, of looking at the world, and of reasoning about it, not appealing to myths and legends and traditions and so on. And that is what makes him distinctively a philosopher in the very general sense of that term, but also a philosopher in our modern sense of the term as well, somebody who is inquiring into the nature of reality. His own successors, Anaximenes and Anaximander, Parmenides, Heraclitus, others in the pre-Socratic tradition after him, all recognized him as the first of their kind and acknowledged the fact that he had initiated a style of debating and thinking about things that they eagerly took up and pursued. And among those pre-Socratic philosophers, so-called because they either come before or were older contemporaries of Socrates, among them two very, very great figures you will have heard of are Parmenides and Heraclitus. You will also, of course, have heard about Pythagoras, whose work was not only mathematical, it was also philosophical. You will have heard of the atomists, Democritus and Leucippus, who argued that physical reality is made out of atoms. Atomos means, in ancient Greek, it means uncuttable, indivisible. So it denotes the very smallest thing there is. And then, of course, Socrates himself, who challenged his fellow Athenians to think more deeply and more carefully about the ideas that they lived by, especially ethical ideas, ideas of courage and continence and honesty and the nature of the good. And then Plato, who recognized that if you were going to give a theory of how we should live, an ethical theory, it needed to be based on a theory of what we are as humans and what world we occupy and how we find out about these things. So it depended upon a theory of knowledge and a metaphysics in order to provide a basis for an ethics. And then Plato's own great pupil, Aristotle, who was a universal genius. I mean, if he lived today, he would almost certainly be a scientist and almost certainly a biologist, because that was a great interest of his. But he was also a person who thought that in order to understand anything, you had to move from first principles. You had to dig into the assumptions and into the very bases of our thought in order to make sense of anything that we examine, whether it's physical nature or biological nature, or whether it's history, or whether it's the nature of political constitutions. Anything that you need, that you want to find out about, you need to have a look at the structure of ideas that underpins them. And this is why his great works, and we know a great deal about what he taught, because all the works of Aristotle that we have are his lecture notes, in fact. He also wrote dialogues like Plato, and apparently the dialogues he wrote were absolutely beautiful from the point of view of their literary style. Somebody much later had described Plato, who famously, of course, is a marvelous writer, described Plato's style as silver and Aristotle's style as gold. But alas, every one of his dialogues has been lost. As you know, about 90% of the literature of the ancient world has been lost. We know plenty of names of books, titles of books and plays and poems, and therefore we can calculate that only about 10% of the body of ancient literature survives to us, including philosophical literature. Well, after Aristotle, of course, and under the influence of Socrates in different ways, there arose a number of schools of philosophy: the Epicurean school, the Stoic school, the Cynic school, and these developed through the Hellenic and the Roman periods, culminating in the case of Plato's Academy and the Platonic philosophy in what came to be called by later scholars Neoplatonism, and the thought of Plotinus and others. And by this time, nearly 1,000 years later, 800 years later, had become quasi-religious. So often happens with philosophical outlooks that they take on the lineaments of a religion after a while. Not Platonism itself, but Neoplatonism, the adoption and adaptation of some of Plato's ideas into an outlook which, in some respects at any rate, began to resemble something like a religion. And it was about that time, about the time of Neoplatonism, so we're talking about the 4th, 5th centuries of the Common Era, AD, when that kind of thinking and inquiry, which we think of as philosophical, came into conflict with the rise of Christianity as a dominating hegemonic way of thinking in the very, very late Roman Empire, both in the West and in the East. So in this book, I tell that story, of course, and then I talk about the strands of philosophy that survived through the medieval period, through the relationship with theology, and then resume the story with Descartes and Bacon, Spinoza, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, the great Immanuel Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, the 19th century philosophers, right up into the 20th century. And the 20th century, right up indeed until our own time, because the 20th century has seen one of the greatest expansions of philosophical thought in all history. Perhaps there is no other period, apart from classical Athens itself and the late medieval period when the universities had been founded, come into existence, and scholastic philosophy was flourishing. Been no other period other than those two, which is anything like the 20th century, where there has been such an enormous amount of philosophical contribution. This is in large measure because of the tremendous expansion of university education and of just the sheer numbers of people who have studied and taught and written about philosophy. Now, everything that I've said so far, of course, relates to the Western tradition in philosophy, but there are other great traditions as well, principally Indian traditions and the Chinese tradition. And what I wanted to do in this book was to say something about them. Now, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, and I don't know ancient Chinese, and therefore, in looking at those traditions of philosophy also, I'm like someone peeping over the garden fence into the neighbor's backyard. But the comparisons are fascinating. And if you are at all familiar with the different aspects of Western philosophy, you are struck by how familiar some of the major contributions to philosophy in Indian thought and in Chinese thought, how familiar they are, how many parallels and connections there are. In the case of the Indian schools of philosophy, metaphysics and the theory of knowledge, there are very, very familiar resonances there. And it's fascinating to see how they handle the same sorts of problems about perception, about knowledge, about truth and logic in their schools of thought, and the comparison with the Western schools of thought. In the case of Chinese philosophy, it's almost all of it addressed to questions of society, politics, and ethics. There's relatively little work in the theory of knowledge or in metaphysics. There is a bit in the most logic school. You may have come across the famous conundrum about a white horse is not a horse. I don't know whether you've ever come across that. You can ask me about it in the question session if you want. But it's mainly about society and about ethics, and it has a very interesting and distinctive view, especially in the Confucian tradition, about what makes a society flourish. And the ideas about human nature, which you find in Mencius and in Xunzi and other thinkers in the Chinese tradition, are of great interest, and indeed in some cases of importance. So to look at the parallels there also is fascinating. And I also, in this book, look at the contribution made by people studying and writing in Arabic and Persian in the medieval period. Now, this is sometimes described as Islamic philosophy. And indeed, no doubt there was a great deal of Islamic theology which was written and thought about in those times. But one has to remember that the works of the philosophers, principally of Aristotle, also of Plato, whose very late dialogue, the Timaeus, was the only one that was known for many, many hundreds of years, and some other of the texts and classics of classical Greek philosophy have been lost to view, but they had survived in that part of the Eastern Roman Empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, and in what had been the Nestorian Christian area of the world, which was, in fact, what we now think of as Iraq and Syria and the Levant. And the scholars in the writing in Arabic and in Persian who have come across these texts and translated them into Arabic or Persian, and who wrote commentaries on them and discussed them, as part of their recovery also of the medical writings and the astronomical writings and other technical writings from classical antiquity, thus preserved many of the philosophical texts and ideas that might otherwise have been completely lost if they hadn't done it. And it was through them that much of the philosophy of antiquity was rediscovered, most notably the works of Aristotle. And so that was very important too. And it wasn't just a matter of preservation, it was also a matter of commentary, some of it of the first interest in philosophical terms, and which had inspired the great debate about Aristotle in Western Europe from the 12th, 13th centuries onwards. So I look at Arabic, Persian, Indian, and Chinese philosophy as well, by peeking over the garden fence at them, so to speak, to see the comparisons and the way that those traditions resonate with our own traditions, although the book is mainly, of course, about the Western tradition. Now, I'll end with this point, that there is now, as so often happens in thinking about pretty well anything in our culture, a revisionist movement afoot in connection with the history of philosophy. I mean, one very obvious thing which is asked is, why are there so few women philosophers in the history of philosophy? And this, of course, is the fact that so few women were given an opportunity even to learn to read and write, let alone to be part of the scholarly and academic discourse or the conversation about ideas through most of the great period of history that we're talking about. The few who were able to contribute were very often contributing to things like ethical thought, or in some cases mathematics and astronomy, or even medicine, so not strictly philosophical in itself. But it is really in the more recent history of philosophy that a number of major women philosophers have emerged. For example, in the last half century, 3/4 of a century or more, contributions made by people like Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot in the analytic philosophical tradition, Simone Weil, Simone de Beauvoir, a number of others whose contributions, whose perspectives have been of very great value. So that in that sense, the history of philosophy is, having been so male dominated for all the wrong reasons, is now becoming much more inclusive and receiving fresh rivers of thought and perspective from many more angles. It's also thought, though, that the normal way of looking at the canon in the history of philosophy is far too selective. We just pick the highest mountain peaks and we forget about the dozens and dozens of other people who contributed and who wrote. Now, I'm very, very conscious of this because with some colleagues, more than 20 years ago now, I edited a 4-volume history of British philosophy in 4 volumes. And there were so many people who wrote about philosophy or contributed to philosophical debates. And of course, when you're writing a 1-volume history of philosophy, you simply cannot be comprehensive. You can only pick the most significant figures. And so you have to tell the canonical story, because if you didn't, then if somebody came along and said, well, I've got a revisionary view, I think that some philosophers are more important than others and we should value them differently or see their contributions differently, that kind of approach wouldn't make sense unless you knew the canonical story, unless you knew what was being revised in this revisionist view. So the account that I've given is a very much canonical account, the story, the mainstream story, if you like, about how philosophy started, how it's developed, and what the great themes in philosophy, in theory of knowledge and metaphysics and ethics and the other branches of philosophy, have developed over time. One final point is this. As you know, from the first half of the 20th century, there came to be a rather marked division between what is called analytic philosophy, mainly in the Anglophone world, and so-called continental philosophy, which is actually a bit of a misdescription because it's not confined to the continent of Europe. Certainly there are people who do what is called continental philosophy in North America and the UK and Australia and New Zealand and so on. But that's how the division is usually described, between analytic philosophy, Anglophone philosophy, which is very scrupulous and analytical, as the name implies. It makes use of ideas in logic, is very knowledgeable about science, and relates a lot of what it does, for example, in the philosophy of mind and theory of knowledge, theory of perception, and so on, to what we know in the sciences of those subjects. And on the other hand, continental philosophy, which in the first half of the 20th century was dominated by people like Husserl and Heidegger, and who look back to Hegel as a major influence. And then after the Second World War, second half of the 20th century, what is described as philosophy in continental philosophy became extremely varied, like the delta of the Nile, many strands. or indeed almost any thinker or writer, from Sartre to Merleau-Ponty to Albert Camus to Gilles Deleuze to Derrida to Foucault, almost anybody you can mention in a foreign accent, writing in French or German or even Italian, in the years after the Second World War up until now, is described as a philosopher. Although actually when you look at their work, you see that indeed some do contribute to philosophical debate of the kind that would be recognized as such by anybody in the tradition of philosophy. Whereas others are, as it might be, sociologists or political theorists or literary critics or linguists or historians of ideas or cultural critics. And so I had the problem in the book of wondering who to include and who to exclude in my account of continental philosophy in its later 20th century guise. So what I did was I picked out figures, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and others who are obviously philosophers. I mean, if you read something like Sartre's Being and Nothingness, it's very distinctively a philosophical work. If you read Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, it's very distinctively a contribution to ethics. The same is true of people like Deleuze and others. It's not so clear with Derrida, but because of the impact that he's had on cultural theory and literary theory, I do include him. But then what I have is what I call a salon des refusés. So these are people like Foucault and a number of others who are not strictly speaking philosophers, but who have some ideas and some contributions which have a philosophical interest about them. Another thing that I did was I regarded this as a history of philosophy, not as a history of science, although science and philosophy was so much the same thing right up to the beginning of the modern period. Nor is it a history of theology, even though a lot of theologians made use of philosophical ideas. And so I'm quite strict about focusing on philosophical debates and philosophical ideas in the theory of knowledge, metaphysics, ethics, and the other pursuits. And I leave to the historians of science and to the historians of theology and to the historians of social theory those aspects which may really merit their own special treatment. So this is very much a history of philosophy as we understand philosophy today. I hugely enjoyed writing it. It's absolutely exhilarating to do it. Of course, it took many years to do because it's a very big subject. And in order to, you will probably come across that remark, I'm sorry I couldn't write a shorter letter, I didn't have enough time. To make things concise and clear, to try to bring a great story within a manageable compass, involves quite a lot of endeavor. And therefore, it did take quite a long time. And when anything takes a long time, you do, of course, fall in love with it. And so when you have to part with it and it goes off to the publisher and it's printed and becomes its own thing out there in the world, that there is a sense of loss. The only solution to which, of course, is to fall in love with something else, a new book. And I've just finished writing that one too. But now I should be very happy indeed to take any questions or comments and see whether I can respond to them.
Anthony, what a tour de force through the history of philosophy, and doing all of this in less than an hour. I'm astounded. I'm absolutely astounded. So well done. For all of you on the Zoom call, you can now unmute yourself and you can actually show the video if you want. We're now getting to the Q&A session, so please feel free to be visible. As I said before, however, this is a videoed lecture, so if you don't want to be seen on a YouTube video at one time, then please don't unmute. But maybe if you unmute now, we can actually show our appreciation to Anthony's fantastic. So thank you very much. Not so easily done, Anthony, by Zoom, but hopefully you receive the applause quite nicely. Well deserved.
You got my name against me.
We've got people talking in the background. If you could go back on mute, not show your video, but go back on mute unless you want to ask a question. That would be really helpful now. As I said, there's 3 ways of asking a question. Raise your hand. I shall try to pick you out. There's too many of you to see on one screen. So you may also just want to actually attract my attention by talking to me. Otherwise, you can raise your hand on Zoom. Or alternatively, you can also ask more questions in the chat room. And there are quite a few already. But before we go into that, I would like to start with a question, Anthony. Given that you've written the history of philosophy, you've already explained why you've excluded certain people from the list, which is quite right. I mean, but my question is, in your own opinion, who is the greatest philosopher that has ever lived?
I always answer that question because I get asked it more than you would imagine. I always answer it by saying that I'm not a fan of beauty contests because Parnassus, the mountain of achievement, is not a peak, it's a plateau. There are many, many, many great philosophers and many to admire and from whom one can learn. But an important point here is that one of the big demands that philosophy makes of us is to examine and challenge our own assumptions and our own thinking, and to do our thinking ourselves. Of course, we have to study and listen and debate and read so that we can enrich and furnish our own reflections. But in the end, it is for us to decide what we are going to think and how we're going to think, and not to become somebody's disciple or follower. You know, one thing that really bothered me when I was a student of philosophy, when I went up to university to study philosophy, was how many people at that time, and I'm now talking about the 1960s and 70s, were passionate followers of Wittgenstein. And for them, the idea was that philosophy just is understanding and agreeing with Wittgenstein. Well, that seemed to me to be quite wrong. I mean, as a schoolboy, I'd read G.H. Lewis and Bertrand Russell and so on. I was really interested in the questions that they raised, and very conscious of the fact that, you know, one had to get stuck in and do some thinking oneself and ask oneself, do I agree with this? And if I don't, why not? And what can I find out about this? And what's the alternative view? So the thought that you should be anybody's disciple or follower, or so admire somebody that you let them do your thinking for you, is a kind of mistake. Having said all that, however, there are a number of philosophers I really do admire. So I hugely admire Aristotle. I hugely admire the great Immanuel Kant. And in fact, I find that there are aspects of Kant's philosophy which it's very hard to disagree with. I'm a great admirer of Hume and of Russell. I think Russell is exemplary, not just in his philosophical work, his early logical work. Some of his later philosophical work is a little, he skates rather fast over some thin ice. He was impatient with, getting too snagged up on details. But he was exemplary in that he regarded the role or task of the philosopher as not just being something you confine to the ivory tower, but which prompts you to take part in the great conversation that society has with itself about what matters, what we should do, how we should address the problems that we meet with.
Very good. I thought you were going to give me a very sort of diplomat's, politician's answer then, but not telling us who you actually rate, but I think you actually did tell us in the end, so much appreciated. I've got a question in the chat room. I'm just linking to your thought of a mountain, and this links to, I suppose, the philosopher Ines, the Norwegian philosopher, think like a mountain. And this is a question by Daisy Houlihan. And is it truer to think of philosophy as a great mountain made up of successive layers of sedimentary rock, or as a series of volcanic peaks, each higher than the last, but with great troughs in between? In other words, a continuous accretion of knowledge built on what went before, or a series of great leaps of the imagination and intellect that are not necessarily dependent on what came before? That's an easy question for you, Anthony.
Yes, very graphic and very geological. So, if I might slightly rephrase it so I can handle it a tiny bit better, I take it that at the core of that question is does philosophy progress? Do we learn things, and can we build on what we've learned or not? And the answer is a great philosophical answer. It is yes and no. So there is a sense in which we do learn an enormous amount from our predecessors in the philosophical tradition. I do think that there are things in philosophy which have been clarified and advanced, and that understanding has deepened massively in connection with a number of philosophical problems. I'll give you one very clear and easy example of this, which is the development of thinking about logic. So the 19th and early 20th century logicians were able to add hugely to the corpus of logical theory and logical technicality over what had been bequeathed from the time of Aristotle and the schoolmen, the scholastic logicians of the medieval period. When you look at contemporary logic and compare it with logic in its earlier phases, you see that that aspect of things really has been very, very progressive indeed. But then on the other side, there are things that, as I mentioned earlier, each individual and each generation has to address again, confront afresh. So ethical and political questions are ones that repose themselves for every generation because of the new conditions that we meet with and the changes that happen in the nature of historical change. Historical change is not always progressive, of course, but when things change, new conditions arise, new challenges occur, we have to think about how we're to live, how we're to respond to those things, what we are to do individually and jointly in meeting those challenges. So in that sense, philosophy is a constant. Philosophy is always a challenge. And indeed, in our personal lives, we can think of philosophy, how we deal with things like loss and grief, how we deal with aging and death, and all the things that are very deep and central in our confrontation with existence. We have to think of our philosophical reflection as a constant preparation for living.
Excellent. Good. Philosophy as a way of life. Excellent. Very good. I've got a question from Deepali. She wants to ask it herself. I mean, knowing Deepali, I'm sure it will do something with Indian philosophy. Deepali.
Hello, thank you. First of all, Professor Grayling, I want to just acknowledge that you've touched on things that were on my mind as I was listening to you for the first 3/4 of your talk, which is, were you going to ever talk about Indian philosophy? And of course you did, because I'm very grateful to you for that, because, when I look at the development of philosophy in the West, you go back to Aristotle, basically, but you go back to the 3rd century, where after Alexander failed to progress beyond the river Indus, which gave the name India to the whole subcontinent, it opened the path. Sorry, there's some noise in the background. It opened the path for philosophers, particularly Pythagoras, who came and spent 30 years in India communicating with Indian philosophers. So the 3rd century BC was the first time that, well, not the first time, was a time of great exchange of ideas. And then, of course, you talked about the Mesopotamian world, the Arabs and the Persians who were in contact, and they were the sort of conduits of Indian philosophy to the West. And 12th century, in fact, was the time that Fibonacci, because Italy with its massive...
Hi, it's Andreas. Could you ask the question, please? Because obviously we've got over 100 people on this call, and they might also want to ask a question.
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, it was just to acknowledge Professor Grayling, my gratitude for having recognized I haven't finished it quite, the connection with Indian philosophy, and just to highlight the fact that all the names that he mentioned in the three periods, the 3rd century BC with the Greek philosophers, the 12th century with the Italian, with the Islamists, so-called Islamists and Persians who acted as conduits, and then ultimately in the post sort of 16th century with the German school, where they investigated they looked into the Vedas. And that influenced the way that philosophy developed and the Enlightenment movement happened in the West, because the West applied the principles of scientific inquiry into the thoughts that were being brought in, and they were able to challenge the theology that was dominating Western society, in the prior to millennia.
Dipali, thank you very much. I'm going to paraphrase this and make it into a question. And that is, Anthony, do you feel that Indian philosophy is woven throughout Western philosophy through the ages?
It's a very interesting question as to whether there was contact between Indian thought and Greek thought in the period from about the 7th century BCE afterwards. It seems to me rather plausible that there probably was, because after all, there was, between the Greek world and the Indian world, there was the great empire of Persia, and long before that, of course, there'd been the Harappan civilization. So there was a lot of a possibility for exchange. Difficult, of course, for people to travel. It took weeks and weeks and weeks, months perhaps, to cross that span of geography. But there must have been some contact, and indeed there is one individual we know of, a man called Pyrrho, who is responsible for Pyrrhonism, the version of skepticism where you don't make your mind up about anything, but you regard everything as being in balance, who may have learned that from the soteriology of practically all the Indian schools, namely that if you understand the nature of reality, you understand that it is the source of suffering, and that therefore to escape from suffering, you have to stop desiring, you have to negate the will. And it may very well be that Pyrrho had learned something from that, which is why he behaved as he did. He was so relaxed and insouciant about everything that he didn't even get out of the way of oncoming traffic. And the fact that he lived into his 90s means that he had a lot of good friends who kept saving him. Well, he is at least an indication that there might have been some contact. And the themes are sufficiently similar to suggest that too. But we have no hard evidence of that, but we do have a lot of legends. I mean, it was mentioned in the course of that comment there that Pythagoras spent 30 years in India. That is not known whether that's true. Pythagoras, of course, spent most of his life in southern Italy. He may very well have gone to India, but we have no hard.
Well, Liverpool, but that was outstanding. That was brilliant.
Sorry?
I think somebody's watching football. I'm just unmuting our football. I think it's Champions League tonight, Anthony. So,
the thing about Zoom is you can multitask, which is wonderful.
Yeah, good. Now, thank you very much for that.
Sorry,
I'm sorry, Dipali, we've got.
I just wanted to comment. Perhaps we can.
Right. Sorry, Dipali, I had to mute you because we've got so many other questions to go through. We've got Charles, who's actually raised his hand via Zoom, which is great. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, Charles?
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. My question is, with the internet, information is freely available to almost anyone now, and you'd hope it would make humanity a lot wiser in general. And it's early days, but so far this doesn't seem to have happened yet. So, are you hopeful? Do you think sort of philosophy and kind of wisdom people will get wiser, or what do you think?
Well, information by itself, data by itself, is not knowledge until it's organized, until it's put into patterns and relationships with itself. It's organized, and then data information becomes knowledge. And knowledge itself is not the last step in what we want. The last step in what we want is understanding that knowledge, knowing how to apply it, knowing what it's worth, knowing which bits of it are really valuable, which bits of it we can use to get further knowledge. So the amount of information which is out there on the internet is, as it were, raw, uncooked, and not yet organized. And we have to make good use of it. We have to apply to it care and thought in order to organize it into something that we can count as knowledge and hope that we can understand it and get wisdom about it.
Good.
What seems to have happened with the internet, and we all hoped that it would be a great agora of democratic debate, where everybody was entitled to put a point of view and make a contribution. And what it has become, alas, is only that in part. It has also become, and perhaps has more become, the biggest lavatory wall in history on which everybody scribbles their awful graffiti and pornography and hate speech and so on. And therefore, the really important thing is something which has, in fact, always been important, but has become yet more important. And that is that if we're not going to censor the internet, which I don't think we should, I think that, the price we pay for having an open forum for discussion is that people are going to say stupid and nasty things on it. So that is the price we have to pay. But what we have to do is we've got to concentrate in our educational processes in making people very good critical thinkers and very good at evaluating the claims, the assertions, the propositions, the ideas that are put out there on the internet. There are so many conspiracy theories, so many falsehoods, so many distorted facts. There's so much noise out there that it's in danger of drowning what is of value. Therefore, the pressure has to be on making people very good at sorting it all out and discerning what's of value from what isn't.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anthony. We've got plenty more questions here in the chat room. Geraldine wants to know, she says, fabulous. I'd like to know about the white horse.
Well, this was a puzzling little crux. The Moist logicians had this puzzling saying that a white horse is not a horse. And there are different ways that one could try to understand this. So for example, it could mean, because the way that it's expressed in Chinese itself is very elliptical, so it's quite difficult to make sense of it. But what it could mean is that because not all horses are white, so you've got chestnut horses and black horses and so forth, the assertion in question means that the concept of a white horse does not exhaust the concept of horse, that the concept of horse is much greater than the concept of white horse. That's one thing that it might mean. Or it also might mean that the property of being white and the property of being a horse are two separate properties. And that to say a white horse is not a horse is to say that you need to distinguish the properties of whiteness and horseness. There are various interpretations. I discuss it actually in the book a little bit in passing, just because it is intriguing. That it is a little indication of the fact that there was at least one school of thought in ancient Chinese philosophy, the Moist school, the followers of Mo Tzu, who had addressed questions about language and logic.
Yeah. Excellent. And it's quite close to the Platonic forms, presumably.
It has connections, yes.
Yeah. Excellent. We've got Dimitra has also, thank you very much for the talk, Professor Grayling. I would like to ask what you take to be the most pressing questions of philosophy today.
I think one of the really great puzzles which philosophers and others are jointly addressing is the question of consciousness and how consciousness arises from the neural activity, the electrochemical activity in the brain, essentially. How do the felt experiences, the so-called qualia, what it feels like to be in pain or hungry or puzzled or upset, how does that arise from the activity of neurons in the brain, given that these phenomena are so very different from the physical phenomena in the brain? Is there a way that we're ever going to be able to understand consciousness in neurological terms? Is there ever going to be a way that the language of psychological concepts, like intention, desire, memory, hope, love, grief, and so forth, can be translated into language about activity in the brain, which doesn't leave anything out? So this is one of the great questions in philosophy, the question of the nature of mind, the nature of consciousness. There are other pressing questions, I think, in ethics, questions about value. Given that in our world, which is highly globalized, there are clashes in views about values, about the position of women in society, about gays, and questions also about how we can find some kind of common good so that the whole of humanity can think of itself as a single nation, the human nation, confronted with problems like climate change, and having to address questions about what the new technologies of AI, for example, and manipulation, genetic manipulation of fetuses, and how we're going to cope with these things and manage them in a way which is ethical and responsible.
Yeah. And I suppose with only a month to go, Anthony, the philosophy of Brexit is much needed.
Well, those of you who have who know anything about my views on Brexit will know that I'm very much turning my attention to getting us back into the EU and bringing the horrible consequences of Brexit to an end as soon as possible. And I think and hope and believe that because we came this close to stopping Brexit this time last year, the folly of the opposition parties agreeing to an election. If they had not done so, we would by now have had our second referendum and we would be safely and securely in the European Union. But if you've looked at the most recent polling, and if you see that people are waking up, even the most gung-ho leavers are beginning to realize what a folly this is, I feel very confident that if we fight, we can get ourselves back into the EU much sooner than later. And if you ask me how, here is the recipe. First, we have to persuade all the opposition parties to make common cause on a platform of electoral reform to get proportional representation. Because if we can reform our electoral system, which is absolutely urgent and essential now, we will have a representative parliament which will give us another say on whether we want to be part of Europe. And when we get that other say, we will be back in.
Definitely.
So the first thing to do is to get the opposition parties. Now, all the opposition parties other than Labour have agreed to make a common platform on electoral reform. Labour has made some promising noises about electoral reform, which is very, very heartening. But we have to get them to agree, and they have to make common cause sensibly. And that means not standing against other parties if they have a better chance of winning in a constituency in return for being allowed in their own constituency. So this is very important. Get electoral reform, then we can get another referendum, then we can get back into the EU.
Excellent. Thank you, Anthony. That sounds like a new book coming on.
Yes.
Excellent. We've got claps on the call here, so the people seem to agree with you by and large. And but let's move away from politics back to philosophy. And I've got Dom saying an excellent talk as always from Professor Grayling. As a segue to last month's insightful lecture, I would like to ask what Professor Grayling's take is on Frank Ramsey's contribution. We had a talk by Simon Blackburn on the Cambridge genius that is Frank Ramsey, who died obviously very prematurely.
Yes, indeed. It was a great tragedy for philosophy, for economics, for logic. This brilliant, brilliant young man in his mid-20s, really, who died on the operating theatre at Guy's Hospital. Snatched away far, far too early. I don't know whether Simon mentioned to you that Frank Ramsey had been Wittgenstein's supervisor for his PhD at Cambridge, which is pretty remarkable when you consider that Wittgenstein was about 40 when he submitted the Tractatus for his PhD, and Ramsey was in his early 20s. But he was very brilliant and great loss. So I think there are a number of contributions he made. One that is really significant, of course, is his view about the nature of truth, because Ramsey had formulated this idea that the truth predicate is in fact something that you could regard as redundant. I mean, to say it's raining and to say it's true that it's raining is to say the same thing. It's not to add anything by adding the assertion that it's true. So this is sometimes known as the redundancy theory of truth, and it gave rise to a series of variations on that view, sometimes called minimalist theory of truth, or it made people think that we only use the truth predicate to save breath, as when you say it's raining and I say it's true, so I don't have to repeat the whole sentence that you've issued, and so on. By the way, I think that the view is wrong, but it's very interesting nevertheless, and it shows that had Ramsay survived, he would have made wonderful contributions to philosophy. By the way, I knew his sister. He had a sister very, very much younger than himself, who was a don at Oxford, and she had retired by the time that I was teaching at Oxford, but she used to come and have lunch sometimes at my college. And I had a number of conversations with her because she was trying to write a biography of her brother. She never finished it. She began to suffer from dementia in her later life. I was never able to finish it, rather sadly. But it was very interesting to talk to her, because their father, Frank Ramsay's father and her father, was a don at Cambridge, I think at Magdalen College, Cambridge. And this the family had no small talk. You could just imagine what their conversations at the breakfast table were like, because they never talked about the weather or the political situation. They always talked about logic and philosophy and theology and things like that. And you could hear this in the way she spoke. I remember once she was very puzzled by a colleague of mine at St. Anne's College, a psychologist, who said he didn't believe in consciousness. And afterwards, she said to me, that man has the most extraordinary view. And I said, oh, you should have challenged him on it. And she said, oh, no, I couldn't bear it, because I wouldn't understand his answer, and yet I wouldn't agree with him. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in.
Very good. Now, listen, we've got so many messages in the chat room, so I need to combine questions. I think Betty Susha and Jesus are asking a question: what is the role of philosophy in the 21st century? And are you worried about free speech suppression in universities?
Well, let me take the second one. Yes, I am. I mean, this is a problem that we've become rather familiar with for some time now. The sort of PC agenda, which in its roots, has much to commend it. It's, after all, about greater inclusion, about listening to alternative voices, about recognizing positionality. I mean, think about the sorts of problems that somebody might face if they are, a woman in a society where women are still discriminated against in all sorts of subtle ways, or being a black person in a society where Black people are discriminated against, sometimes in very overt and even violent ways, or being gay in a society where, except in the metropolitan area, there still might be suspicion or dislike. Now imagine being a Black gay woman. So you're all three things, and you've got all sorts of problems given the multiple position that you're in. So, being inclusive and generous and wanting to respect and honor people who have these sorts of difficulties is a very good thing. And that's what the PC agenda is about. But then, of course, it goes too far. And it gets to the point where you're frightened to say anything in case you offend somebody. And the very idea that being offended is enough to shut other people up is in itself just simply not acceptable. You just have to learn, that the way to deal with other people's offensive speech is to have better arguments to put back at them. I say to my students, my college is a safe space for free speech. And that if people use their free speech to say bad things, then you use better speech to argue against them and to refute them. And that's the way that we should approach these things. That's very important.
Thank you. The next one is a very easy one for you, Anthony, and that comes from Anna. What is the meaning and purpose of the universe?
It doesn't have one. The universe doesn't have a meaning or a purpose. It's just there. And by a whole series of physical and chemical accidents, so are we. And this is a very important point. It's actually a very deep point. The fact that there is no antecedent purpose, that neither you nor I nor anybody involved in this discussion tonight was sent here into the universe for a purpose, means that we, each of us, have a responsibility to make our own purpose, to create meaning and value in the world, to make choices which will ensure that our lives are worthwhile and our relationships with other people are positive in their effect. And, so this is something which is familiar from that series of debates, for example, in existentialism, where the argument is that existence precedes essence. We exist, but then we have to create ourselves. We have to create what we are. We have to make choices about how we're to live, what we're to do, what values we're to pursue. We have to be the source of meaning in our lives. So I often say to taxi drivers who, when they find out that I'm a professor of philosophy, they say, all right, Governor, what's the meaning of life? And I say, well, I know the answer to that question, not because I found it, but because right from the time of Socrates onwards, we've had it pointed out to us that the meaning of your life is what you make it. There's not one size fits all thing, which is the meaning of life for everybody and the same for everybody. Each one of us has to create meaning. The meaning of your life is what you make it. Excellent. By the way, there is a more general argument which I like as well. It says an argument I sometimes offer to people, which is this: take it that the universe came into existence, perhaps at the Big Bang. It just exists. It is what it is, and 13.72 billion years after the Big Bang, in one little corner of one galaxy in the universe, this planet, chemical events result in there being self-aware, conscious, intelligent, or semi-intelligent beings who are aware of the fact that they exist. And then after a while, it might be 1,000 years or 10,000 or 1,000,000 years, that intelligence, that conscious life ceases. It becomes extinct or blows itself up, or it plexits, that it exits the planet, okay? And then there is no more intelligence and consciousness in the universe. So the whole history of the universe has this one little brief moment of consciousness or self-awareness. Now, if the quantum of good, of pleasure, of love, of satisfaction, of enjoyment is greater than the quantum of suffering and misery and difficulty in that moment of consciousness, then that makes the whole history of the universe good. But if the quantum of bad, of suffering, is greater than the quantum of good or pleasure, then the whole history of the universe, the fact that the universe existed at all, is bad. Therefore, we have to be good. We have to enjoy ourselves, and we have to create everything positive that we can create.
I love the philosophic calculator for the universe, Anthony. That's great. We've also got another one about could climate restoration unite humanity in a common quest? And that's by John Nissen.
Look, I think that if all the people around the world made common cause to try to address the problem of climate change, working together, making compromises, making sacrifices to do it, then, you know, it would be like the way a people comes together and works together when confronted with a great danger, as in wartime, for example, the sort of wartime spirit. What is astonishing is that the climate problem that we face at the moment is very, very serious and very dangerous, not for the planet, but for humanity. I mean, the planet will survive and recover and go its way. There have been many extinctions and catastrophes in the past, and the planet has survived. But the climate problem is a problem for us, for human beings, and for many other species who we carelessly are putting at risk and in danger. So we have to, we do have to come together. And if we could understand the nature of that danger and pull together, then we could probably overcome many of these difficulties that relativism about values causes.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. I've got two more questions. One from Janet. You've been raising your hand physically and by Zoom, so I think you definitely deserve your question. Over to you, Janet.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think we observed that most of the people around this table are of a certain age. And I have a 14-year-old grandson who's very keen on sport and drama and music and has an open mind. He's into physics too. He knows I'm very keen on philosophy, belong to a group and so on. Where would you, Professor, advise me to advise him to start poking around in this very interesting business of philosophy.
You know, there is a wonderful little book by Bertrand Russell, which I'm sure you may know, and many on this call will know, called The Problems of Philosophy. It was published in 1912, so over 100 years ago now, but it is so clear and so brief, and it sets out some of the very central problems in philosophy in a wonderfully clear way. And I would put that into his hands. As a Christmas present, it would be a wonderful thing, because you never know, it might just catch fire.
Yeah, no, very good. Keep him away from the phenomenology of spirit from Hegel, by all means. He will never touch philosophy ever again. So I think Anthony suggests...
What's the name of this book, Professor, please?
It's called The Problems of Philosophy, and it's by Bertrand Russell.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. As opposed to the problems with philosophy. So it's the problems of philosophy.
Problems of philosophy, Bertrand Russell. I like.
I'm looking with longing at the glass of wine on Janet's table there, which is what I'm going to reward myself with in a minute.
Anthony, we're nearly there. We're nearly there. But it would be very remiss of me not to give the last question to our philosophy convener, Don. Don, I'm sure you've been waving throughout this. So do you have your own question to finish us off?
Oh my goodness, I'd often almost given up, but I was going to echo your very first question by asking Professor Grayling, who is the worst philosopher?
Well, I'm sure the worst philosopher is one who is so bad that we don't know anything about him or her. Now, it's interesting you should ask me that question, by the way, because I expect you're all familiar with the so-called ontological proof of the existence of God. This is the proof that says there is something in the universe which is the most perfect thing there is. A most perfect thing which actually exists is more perfect than one that doesn't exist. Therefore, the most perfect thing exists. Then the most perfect thing is identified as the deity, okay? Now, of course, there are so many things wrong with this argument that we will be here until breakfast time if we were to pick it apart. But I mean, one of the quickest and easiest things to say is that the most perfect thing in the universe is very probably you, Don. Even though you may not be completely perfect, you might be more perfect than the rest of us, in which case you are the most perfect thing in the universe. But it doesn't follow, unless I'm terribly mistaken, that you are the deity. So all you need to be is the least imperfect thing in the universe to be the most perfect thing, and therefore it doesn't follow that there is a God. But the reason I mentioned in connection
with is pretty bad all round there. Because and I'm certainly not anywhere near the most perfect. But
the reason I mention it, Don, is that it relates to your question about the worst philosopher, which is this. Think of this, that argument, the ontological argument for God's existence, by parity of reasoning, is an argument that there cannot be a devil, as follows. There is something in the universe which is the least perfect thing there can be. That is the worst thing there can be. But a worst possible thing, which doesn't exist, is thereby even worse than one that does. Therefore, the worst possible thing doesn't exist.
Oh.
There you go. There you go.
Now, these are just sophisms. These are just sophisms.
Absolutely, but I think that's a great note.
It scores on humour, if not on understanding.
Yeah, good. Listen, thank you once again. I think we've come to the end now. It's just coming up to 9 o'clock. So a big thank you from me once again, Anthony, for a very erudite tour de force through the whole history of philosophy. And I'm sure that many people want to unmute themselves at this very moment and give you a big round of applause. So here we go. Very good, and thank you very much. Just before you leave, just to let you know about what's happening in the Q1 of next year in our philosophy series. We'll kickstart in January with Have Vegans Got It Right? And that's a dual act between Don and I. Don is going to take one side, I'll take the other. Don will start, I will follow, and we'll talk about whether vegans have got it right or not. We then have a lecture by Stephen Mulhall, Professor Stephen Mulhall from New College, Oxford, on phenomenology, which would be very interesting. And Anthony made reference to phenomenology today. So very much in the sort of European tradition. That would be interesting. And in March, we've got Julian Baggini, who's the editor of the Philosophers magazine and author, and he's going to give us a talk on pragmatism, East and West. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's lecture. I hope you have a fantastic Christmas, despite the fact we shouldn't really have Christmas this year, and be a Scrooge for the sake of humanity until the vaccine is found. But I wish you a wonderful Christmas, and as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and most of all, stay sane. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.